The most important thing about death and the afterlife is that whatever you think about it, that we're ready for it, we're prepared for it. So that if death comes suddenly or slowly, whenever it comes, we know that we're right with God. We know that we're at peace with God through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we've got that assurance that God will take us safe into his everlasting arms.
All I could see was this light coming in.
The Holy Spirit went, it blew into me.
I have never been the same since then.
That was it. I'm done.
I was born again.
Welcome to the Weird Christian Podcast. I am your host, Samuel Delgado, and this is episode 60. I interview Paul Williamson about death and the afterlife. We get into ghost, hell, near-death experiences, and what the Bible has to say about it all. So, with no further ado, let's get weird. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
All right, so why don't we just start just by hearing a little bit about yourself. Tell us kind of how you grew up and how you came to know Christ.
Okay. I was born and bred in Northern Ireland. I brought up really in a church-going family. They weren't Christian in the evangelical sense, but they would have attended church every week and sent us to Sunday school, my brother and I. I would also have gone to sort of little gospel meetings and so on for kids. So I think I knew the gospel from a fairly early age, even though my parents weren't born-again Christians. We certainly weren't, my brother and I. I think around the age of 10, I went to a tent Good News meeting, Good News Bible clubs there, I think you know. So it was like a Good News Bible club, and I went to that, and at the end of the week, I professed faith. Unfortunately, the guy, best friend, he professed faith as well. But I went back home and told his mother said to him, well, you soon grow out of that nonsense. And unfortunately, he did. And unfortunately, so did I. So for most of my early teenage years, I lived a very sort of rebellious life. My father left home when I was about 14. And so I didn't really have a strong parental hand to keep me right. And instead of sort of supporting my mother at a difficult time for her, I basically took advantage and lived the life of a rebel. But some of my friends that I ran about with became Christians probably in my late teens. And I could see the tremendous change in their lives. And I think God used that really to challenge me, because I knew exactly what they were like, because I was like them. And I could see the amazing grace of God in their lives and just the transformation, and that spoke to me. One night, I decided I wouldn't go to the pub, which is what really I did at the weekend. I just sort of worked during the week and then went to the pub at the weekend and used up my money on alcohol. But one Friday night, I was sitting in the pub, and I looked at the people around me and thought, what a miserable looking bunch they are. And something dawned on me, and I'm one of them. So I've never done this before. I just got up and walked home, and on the Saturday night I refused to go out. So my mother, who at that stage had given her life to Christ, probed a bit to find out what was going on, and we ended up basically getting down on our knees, and she led me to faith in Jesus. So I repented of my sin, trusted in Jesus. She had kept praying for me despite the obnoxious way that I behaved. But God transformed my life, and I started going to a Baptist church. I've been brought up Presbyterian, but unfortunately the church I was brought up in, the minister didn't really preach the gospel. Apparently he preached the gospel really well at funerals, not the rest of the time. So I started going with my pals to the Baptist church that they went to, and I realized within 6 weeks if I was going to grow, I needed to go to the Baptist church, because that's where I was going to get fed and sort of discipled as a Christian. So I went there, and the pastor there, they ran all kinds of different activities for youth, and they got me to testify very early on, and then he even invited me to preach in the evening service. And he just steadily encouraged me really to use the gifts that I had, and probably didn't realise at the time. And he encouraged me to think about it going into full-time Christian ministry. He himself had wanted to go to Bible college and get trained, but they had rejected him not because he wasn't sort of academic enough, but that didn't put him off encouraging me to go and get fully trained for Christian ministry. So I gave up the business that I had, and I went into full-time theological education, intending to become a Baptist minister. At the end of 5 years, I became a Baptist minister, but I also started teaching in the college on my day off, something for which my wife has never really forgiven me, using my day off to teach. At the end of 3 years, I thought, I can't keep this going. My wife was probably telling me the same. I can't keep working 24/7. So I decided I'd teach full-time. I was really interested in keeping the college conservative evangelical, and I think it was really the Old Testament position was going to possibly go to someone who wasn't conservative evangelical, so I thought I should really apply for that job, and I did. And so I worked there for, I think it was about 9 years, during which I got a PhD. And then I got a telephone call out of the blue one day from the principal of Moore College here in Australia, who thought I might be interested in a job. And quite honestly, I wasn't ever intending leaving Ireland. We were quite happy there. But he said, well, if you're remotely interested, I'll come up and have a chat to you, because he was in Dublin. So I said, well, you might as well come and we'll have a chat. So he persuaded us to come for a 3-year secondment. So we kept our jobs in Ireland, and my wife and I and our 2 young boys came across to Australia for what we thought was 3 years. But we're still here, and we've been here now for 22 years. During that time, my boys grew up. They made professions of faith when they were children, but I think today one of them would still claim to be a Christian, but he doesn't really live a Christian life. The other one seems to have little or no interest in Christianity whatsoever, which is unfortunate. But just as my mother kept praying for me, my wife and I keep praying for our boys. We know that God in His grace will extend mercy to them. That's what we're praying for.
Yeah, amen. Wow, awesome. Yeah, I love that story. So tell me, how is it that you came about? We're talking about your book, Death and Afterlife, tonight. So how was it that you came about writing that book?
That's a great question. I teach Old Testament at college, and at Moore College, every year they have a annual called as lectures. And 1 year it's an international speaker, and the other year it'll be a member of faculty. So sooner or later you get asked to do the annual college lectures, and I got asked to do it in 2000, at least to actually do the talks in 2016. So I scratched my head thinking, what am I going to do these annual college lectures on? And I've always been interested in personal eschatology. One of the first books I read when I became a Christian was Hendrickson's Death and the Afterlife, which I found really, really interesting, because he covers so much ground, so many very interesting questions that he addresses. And I thought I'd like to revisit that particular issue and see what are the issues that people are talking about today, and what does the Bible have to say about them. So I thought that would be a good thing to look at. So I prepared 5 talks really on death and the afterlife, with an introductory talk at the very start. And that then turned into Death and the Afterlife, the book. Nice. I sent it to Don Carson, who's the editor of the series. I think it was Thursday night, just before before I went to bed, and I got up early the next morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there was an email reply from Don Carson, who had read the book and wanted to include it in the series. And I thought to myself, I wish I could do that.
Yeah. Wow. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, I think that's cool that that this was something that was like a personal interest to you. Hopefully, we have a lot of people listening that feel the same way. I certainly feel like it's one of those topics. It's so core and so important. It's almost a lead-in for a lot of people as far as evangelism. The question of what happens to you when you die. It's something that everyone ponders at some point, and there's answers in the Bible, but there's also still a lot of mystery there as well. I like how you explored, all different aspects of death and afterlife from multiple perspectives. So I want to start by talking about the intermediate state, because I think most people, listening are familiar, and this is kind of our concept of what happens after we die is the intermediate state. Yet that has not always been kind of our concept that we have of it. So can you explain, what is the intermediate state and how has that changed over time? The concept of it and our understanding of it.
The intermediate state, I suppose, it just really sometimes referred to as the interim state. But what happens when you die? After you die, do you continue to exist in some shape or form between death and resurrection? Because as Christians, we believe that we are going to be raised on the last day. But what is going to happen to us in that period between our personal death and the last day of resurrection? When I was a young Christian, I think all the books that I read at that stage certainly were teaching an intermediate state, and it became to me just part of evangelical doctrine that there was an intermediate state. So between death and resurrection, you either went to be with Christ in heaven, or you ended up in some form of hell straight away. Whenever I started looking at the sort of these lectures, I realized that there was quite a bit of debate nowadays about the intermediate state, mainly because when I was at college, we used to debate whether a human was made up of body, soul, and spirit, or just body and soul, or body, soul, stroke spirit, or soul and spirit different, or just the same thing.
Yeah. Whereas
more recently, the debate is whether humans are dichotomous, which would be body and some kind of non-material part, just like a soul or spirit, or if humans are just a single entity. So are we made up of two parts, one of which can survive death, or are we made up of only really one part, and that part, when it dies and remains dead until the day of resurrection? So that's really what got me thinking about discussing the intermediate state, because I wanted to see what biblical evidence is there really to support the idea of an intermediate state, and what that obviously also means you need to look at what evidence there is in the Bible for what I'll call dualism, a dualistic sort of dichotomy between body and soul. So does the Bible provide evidence that we are made up of two parts, at least, body and soul, or is a more biblical way of looking at things that we're actually just sort of a body-spirit thing?
Yeah.
We're alive, and when we die, we cease to exist altogether. So there's not an awful lot I discovered there's nowhere near as much evidence as I was sort of thinking there would be in the Bible for sort of an interim or intermediate state. Yet I think there is sufficient evidence to make it a viable doctrine. Some today would argue that there is no intermediate state. When you die, you're dead, and that your next sort of conscious moment after death is the last day resurrection.
Right.
Whereas there are texts, not that many, but there are enough texts to warrant belief in basically even after death we exist in some sphere. So the believer, the Christian, Paul certainly seems to talk about being absent from the body and present with the Lord. So that's the sort of the text that most would use to support sort of an interim state for Christians. There's not as much in terms of an interim state for non-Christians. Probably the most obvious text that people point to would be Jesus' story of the Rich Man Lazarus, where both of them die, and it's clearly before the last day resurrection, because the rich guy talks about his brothers. They want someone to be sent to warn his brothers about this terrible place that he's in. But both the rich man and Lazarus are in an intermediate state. Lazarus is with Abraham, presumably in the celestial abode, whereas the rich man is in hell and is in torment. So that's what I mean by an intermediate state.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there's the example of the thief on the cross, or Jesus said that today you will be with me in paradise. And so, that was just kind of always my concept of life after death, based off of those verses. And I never really heard of soul sleep, and probably till a few years ago, I didn't realize that was a doctrine that some believed, that you're basically just asleep. And it certainly there's a lot of Old Testament verses that could allude to that. So I think perhaps
the Bible certainly uses sleep as a metaphor for death.
Yeah.
And the question then is, do you push it more literally? Like the people I'm talking about today wouldn't believe in soul sleep so much as we don't have a soul, so there's nothing to sleep.
Right.
So
wow.
It's basically,
yeah,
they're thinking of non-existence really between that period of, if you died today and Jesus doesn't come for another 100 years, you have basically spent 100 years out of existence.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, yeah, like yourself, Samuel, like I always just assumed that Christians believed in an interim state, and that's what the Bible taught.
Yeah.
And that's why I sort of wanted to look to see, is there enough evidence in the Bible to support what I thought was the typical Christian doctrine. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was.
I think I agree. That's interesting. Yeah. I do remember reading that now. Yeah, that concept is basically not existing whatsoever. That's really interesting. I do want to ask about the rich man and Lazarus, because that is something that's a proof text that's used for several different doctrines. Some would say that it's a parable, and some would say that Lazarus was a historic person. What's your take on that?
Certainly in Jesus' parables, he doesn't normally name anyone, so that would make it stand out as different from most of Jesus' parables, because it doesn't usually have he'll talk about there was a certain man. Yeah. But it doesn't actually name people. Yeah. And that's why I think that's the main reason that people have suggested that it's more than a parable. I used to think that, I used to agree with that. I'm not too sure today. I think I'm quite happy to say that it's a parable rather than actually sort of a biography. if you like. But I suppose the more significant question really is whether or not Jesus meant us to take the story, at least the details of the story, meant us to understand that as a true account of what happens after we die.
Right.
And some today would argue that Jesus wasn't really telling it as a true account. He was telling it as if, suppose a modern preacher said, imagine someone dies and they're standing at the pearly gates and St. Peter asks them, why should I let you into heaven? None of us, if we heard a preacher saying that, would imagine that, would take the details of that sort of concept literally.
Yeah.
Like St. Peter's not going to be standing at the pearly gates asking people for a pass to get into heaven.
Yeah.
So it's just a story to illustrate a truth. And some would take the parable of the Rich Man Lazarus in that sort of way, that it's really just a story that Jesus told to illustrate a truth. And some would say the truth that he's trying to illustrate has got nothing to do with eschatology at all.
Right, yeah.
My problem with that is that if Jesus is telling that story and using those images the way that he does, and he doesn't intend us to draw any eschatology from it, we would have no way of knowing that. And Jesus seems to be endorsing some beliefs that would have been fairly common in the first century. And therefore, I think it would be very naive of Jesus to use that story as an illustration and not intend his readers to actually accept some aspects of it to be a true account of what things are like.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Because I think some people would favor the historical view because they want to use that as a proof text for a certain doctrine about what happens to you after you die. And then some people on the opposite end would rather see it as a parable for the opposite reason, to say that we can't really use this as a proof text for what happens after you die. So it's one of those things. It's really interesting sort of think about. Certainly, when we look at the point of the story, it doesn't seem to be, the point doesn't seem to be necessarily about what happens when you die. But like you said, clearly he was using, this illustration, or we see we have kind of two different areas of, what we might call an afterworld, or Hades, or abode of the dead, sort of concept that they would have been familiar with, the listener of that time. So I was planning on getting to this later.
Because you wouldn't want to try and apply all the details of the story literally.
Right.
Because if you applied it all literally, then in this afterlife, there's going to be communication between people in one place and people in another place. And I don't think the Bible really teaches that. So there are some facets of the story that don't seem to be a true representation of the afterlife.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. And a lot of people would say, okay, clearly the rich man was not able to communicate with those that are living, right? So they would use that to say, this is to mean that there's no such thing as ghosts because of this this example here in the Bible. So I wanted to ask about that. I think you talked about the Witch of Endor, if I'm correct. That's almost one of the only clear examples of when we see like a ghost story in Scripture. We hear references to ghosts maybe in a couple other places. But what is your take on ghosts?
Well, whenever I came to Moore College, one of my colleagues here, I found out that he believed in ghosts, and I thought he was nuts. but I've come to see that there's a lot more evidence for his position than I once did. Are there such a thing as ghosts? I suppose that the question is, if there is no intermediate state whatsoever, then ghosts are ruled out.
Right.
There can't be ghosts if there's no intermediate state. So in other words, if you die and you're dead and that's it until the day of resurrection, there's no place for ghosts.
Sure.
But if you do believe in an intermediate state, that does allow room for the idea of ghosts. But I suppose, what do we mean by ghosts, and what type of interaction can we have with ghosts? I think in the New Testament there are examples where some kind of belief in ghosts is reflected. So the disciples obviously saw Jesus at times and thought he was a ghost.
Yeah.
And Jesus' response was not, "Don't be stupid, there's no such thing as ghosts." His response was really, "Ghosts don't have flesh and bones like I do."
Right.
Which is a strange response, because you'd be expecting him to say, "Don't be so silly, there's no such thing as ghosts." But he says, "I can prove that I'm not a ghost because I've got a body."
Right. Yeah.
That implies that ghosts don't have bodies. Again, whenever when Peter was in prison in Acts and he was under sentence of execution, whenever he was let out of jail, they came knocking at the door. They thought it was his ghost, his spirit.
Yeah.
And again, the Pharisees would have believed in spirits, i.e. ghosts, and the resurrection, whereas the Sadducees didn't believe in either.
Right.
They didn't believe in sort of an afterworld at all, an interim state. They didn't believe in a resurrection. So I think that there are biblical texts that you could use to support the idea of ghosts, but I suppose I want to put a caveat on that and say that ghosts, certainly if they do exist, I'm not sure what interaction they could have with living human beings, and they certainly couldn't do us any harm.
Sure. Yeah.
But could there be such a thing as ghosts? Well, obviously there could if there is an intermediate state. And I suppose when I was doing the lectures, I used this illustration. Whenever I think it was Elisha in the Old Testament got the servant to see the spiritual world and all the angels that were protecting the city at that stage, it was something he couldn't comprehend naturally, but sort of the veil was pulled away, and he actually, for a moment, actually saw the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's like that for us, that sometimes that sort of the curtain, if you like, is pulled back momentarily, and people can see sort of another dimension.
Sure. Yeah.
But I wouldn't go to the stake over it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a fascinating topic, and one that I could probably dedicate an episode on, and there's a lot of different takes on it, and I would say I would agree with everything that you said, and most of what I kind of hear in Christian circles when you talk about ghosts, it's refreshing to hear you say that, because a lot of times what you hear is that there's no such thing as ghosts, and like I said, they'll use that verse, this parable of Lazarus and the rich man, as an example, and then they'll basically attribute any type of ghost activity as demonic, which I think there may be some truth to that. Do you think that a demon could pose as a dead loved one in order to lead you astray or to deceive you, or have some sort of nefarious reasons behind that?
Yeah, but like the word for demon in the New Testament, daimonia, it could be argued that word is actually referring not to Satan's minions, demons, likely referring to the spirit world, ghosts. So, is it possible? I think the answer has to be. I think my answer would be yes, but I don't think we need to fear ghosts. If they do exist, I don't think we need to feel threatened by them.
Sure.
Greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. I'm not sure. When I was sort of doing the study, I did come across a few people, some of whom I felt were sane people, who claimed to have seen, something, that we would call ghostly. Yeah. So I find it difficult sort of to turn around and say, well, that person just imagining that. Sure. I assume they have had some kind of experience. I'm not dead sure how to explain that experience, but certainly one of the ways you could explain it would be in terms of that curtain being just, for some reason, being blown back, and they get a sort of a glimpse into the afterlife. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of ghost stories. I mean, almost everyone you meet probably either has a ghost story that they've experienced, or they have a loved one or a friend that they know that has had, kind of a story with the ghost. And, my perspective is talking about the intermediate state. Clearly we obviously know that God is very aware of what's going on in our dimension, and he's able to interact. We see that with the angels as well, that they seem to be aware of what's going on with humans. And if we're with God in the intermediate state, it only seems natural to also draw the conclusion that we would be aware of what was going on here as well. And so that's, as far as how they're interacting, and in the Old Testament as well, it seems to be, a practice that's forbidden to contact the dead. Yeah. So it seems a little silly to argue that there's no such thing as ghosts if it's something that Israelites are instructed not to do, not to practice necromancy. So it almost seems that they're not forbidden because it doesn't work. Right. Yeah. Which is quite interesting again. And again, the other nations all seem to have a very strong belief in what we call ghosts. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Interesting. Cool. All right. So let me ask you another question. I was this is one that I have really pondered, and I'm not sure how much you touched on it in your book, but you may have a little bit. There's almost seems to be a shift in Old Testament theology and New Testament theology as far as afterlife, but certainly what Jesus did on the cross and his resurrection seemed. Do you think that made a difference between what would happen to a believer, or maybe an Israelite that died pre-resurrection, and a believer that had died post-resurrection? Is that experience or intermediate state? Did something change? I'm not so sure, Samuel. The problem, I think, is that the Old Testament says very, very little about it. So it leaves us very much in the dark. And it's only the New Testament that sort of says more about it. So, when you ask what happens after death, if you're just answering that question just from the Old Testament, I think the answer that would be given really is that people go to Sheol. That's basically what the Old Testament seems to teach, that everyone goes to Sheol. Yeah. Which is the Old Testament equivalent really of Hades. basically the place of the dead. But there are a few texts here and there which sort of seem to suggest something more than that. So there's a couple in the Psalms where it suggests that certainly for the believer, that they will go to be with God, as opposed to just going into this sort of netherworld or Sheol. Certainly with the resurrection of Jesus brought immortality and life to light in a way that wasn't true before. And Jesus was in his resurrection brought the future forward. So his resurrection is really a foretaste of the final resurrection and the guarantee of the final resurrection. So again, think of the conversation that Jesus had with Mary and Martha in relation to resurrection. They believed in the resurrection as something that was going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
And Jesus, brought it forward. I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes me, and so on. So that there's life now, and there's resurrection life now. So you can have the future now. So the Christian is someone who, if you like, has been raised with Christ now. So we're in a sense resurrected now, in that we're brought into newness of life, and we will even after we die. Death is not going to stop us being resurrected like Jesus in the fullest sense. But I don't think you get that picture in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament, the closest you get to it are passages that say the life of Job, where Job is sort of saying, if only there were such a thing. He's not saying, this is my clear conviction.
Right.
Interesting, when God says to Ezekiel, can these dry bones live? Ezekiel, like if we were standing in Ezekiel's shoes and God had shown us the valley of dry bones and asked us, can these dry bones live? The Christian would say, absolutely. Whereas Ezekiel says, you alone know, Lord. So Ezekiel wasn't absolutely sure.
Yeah.
He didn't have a sure and certain resurrection hope that we do. So that certainly is a difference, that Christ's resurrection gives us a sure and certain hope of resurrection that I think Old Testament saints didn't have. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it does. So in practically speaking, you think that it would have been the same experience, yet that may not have been revealed as clearly, obviously, as it is for us.
Like there's certainly, like Daniel 12 does talk about resurrection, and Isaiah 25, 26 talks about resurrection. So there are Old Testament texts that do talk about resurrection, but they seem to be referring primarily to sort of something that's going to happen for some folk, as opposed to something that's going to happen for everyone. Whereas the New Testament clarifies that, and this resurrection is going to happen for everyone. Like Jesus thought that it's not just the righteous that are going to be raised from the dead, it's both the righteous and the wicked are going to be raised from the dead.
Right. Wow. So I didn't actually plan on asking this question, but something you said reminded me of Abraham's bosom. We read that, and I think probably the first time I read that, it really threw me off. I didn't really have a concept for it, and I actually heard different takes on what that means, Abraham's bosom. So I'm just curious, what's your take on what we should understand that to mean?
Well, I think it's a metaphor being used for paradise. So Jesus said to the rich man, today you will be with me in paradise. Like both in the Old Testament and the intertestamental literature, you get this concept of paradise. So if you like, this sort of celestial Eden, or this new Eden, where they're going to enjoy this perfect relationship with God. That's a concept. And I suppose Abraham is, if you like, the father of faith, the father of the faithful. And he's, to be said that you're going to be in Abraham's bosom is you're going to be, it's like us saying we're going to be with Christ. So for an Old Testament perspective, to be in Abraham's bosom was to be in the place of harmony and peace with God, so the place of paradise.
Yeah.
So whenever Jesus uses it, obviously when he's talking about Lazarus as in Abraham's bosom, so he's with Abraham, and where's Abraham? Abraham is in the place of the righteous. And obviously in the Gospels, you have the Jews, who the enemies of Jesus very often claim to be the children of Abraham. They see themselves as the children of Abraham, and Jesus says, if you were children of Abraham, you'd believe me. So if you like, these people who thought that they were going to, who were looking forward to Abraham's bosom, living with Abraham in this paradise to come, Jesus, if you like, turns the tables on them and says, look, people who you least expect are going to be in Abraham's bosom, and you yourselves are not going to be there. So it's just it's a Jewish metaphor, I think, for what we'll call heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost just like an idiom that they might have been familiar with.
Yeah.
It's completely foreign to us, but of course we have all sorts of sayings like that we say that, you know, would be lost on a different culture. Okay. Yeah, so you also have a whole chapter dedicated to hell, and and you know, that's also another one of those topics I didn't really quite ever hear anything other than eternal torment, probably until a few years back as well. So you basically covered, you know, from my memory, kind of the concepts of eternal torment, and then I guess a terminal punishment. What's your conclusion on your understanding of hell?
I came to it with a very open mind, in that I was an inquirer wanting to see, did the Bible actually teach what I'd been led to believe? And I'd obviously been led to believe in eternal torment. So like that's the traditional sort of evangelical approach. And I was sort of shocked and surprised when I found out that some evangelicals didn't actually believe that. So I suppose I was wanting to go and see, okay, why did they not believe that? Is there good biblical justification for an alternative point of view? And it turns out today, like there are really two alternative points of view. There's the terminal punishment, annihilationism point of view, which an increasing number of evangelicals have come to hold. And then there's what I'll call the restorationist position, or evangelical universalism, which is basically hell. It's real, it's conscious punishment, but it's not necessarily eternal. It's only eternal until the person in hell actually repents, and once they repent, they'll be, if you like, let out of hell and brought into heaven. But in the chapter that I wrote on hell, I limited it to the first of those options. I wanted to sort of focus on the restoration position when I dealt with heaven. So I didn't really deal with hell in that chapter. On hell itself, I didn't deal with the evangelical universalists there. I dealt more with those who argue really that the wages of sin is death. Very clear scriptural verse. And death means death. It doesn't mean anything else. It doesn't mean eternal death in the sense of an ongoing existence. It just means death of termination. So it's terminal judgment. Again, I've been working on this ever since. In fact, I've just finished writing another piece on this for a book on two views of hell. And I think I'd have to acknowledge, and I think I acknowledge in the book, but I'd have to acknowledge that if you were just using the Old Testament, there'd be a pretty strong argument for reading hell as simply terminal judgment. what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. They were destroyed by fire, but they were destroyed. They didn't get sent to some kind of ongoing hell. They basically were destroyed and burnt up. And time and again in the Old Testament, that's the picture you get. In fact, there are very few texts that suggest anything other than what we'll call terminal judgment. So God is a consuming fire, and that consuming fire does what consuming fire does. It consumes, so it destroys. So judgment in the Old Testament certainly is presented in that way. So when you look at examples of judgment in the Old Testament, it does seem to be terminal in that sense. Two of the texts that are used really to argue for eternal conscious torment from the Old Testament, you've got the last verse of Isaiah, and you've got Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. I think it's verse 3 or verse 2. Again, I think the traditional position has made too much of those verses, because when you look at the verse in Isaiah, the very end of Isaiah, the picture there is not of conscious human beings being burnt in some kind of eternal flame forever and ever. That's not the picture in Isaiah 66 at all. The picture in Isaiah 66 is of dead human beings, corpses, being consumed by worms and flames that never go out. So you've got worms that never die, and you've got flames that never go out. But what both those things are consuming, if you like, are corpses, not conscious human beings.
Sure, yeah.
So traditionally, those two verses have been used by traditional evangelicals to support the idea of eternal conscious torment. I'm not sure that they do. I think that you can point out that the worms don't need to never die, and the flames don't need to keep on burning forever,
right?
Unless the work that they're doing is sort of ongoing and needs to keep going for long, ever after. So you can make that kind of argument, and I think that's a valid argument. That the worm doesn't die and the flames don't go out, but it doesn't, I think, resolve the main point, which is in Isaiah 66, what those worms are working on, what the fire is working on, are corpses. They're not conscious human beings.
Yeah.
Daniel talks about everlasting shame. He doesn't go on to explain what that everlasting shame is going to be like. So I think it's too much to argue from Daniel 12, as it's too much to argue from Isaiah 66, eternal conscious torment. Now, I think that when you get the New Testament, it gets much more complex, because, number one, those images, those Old Testament images of fire consuming the enemies of God, those images are certainly picked up in the New Testament and used by both Jesus and the apostles. So those are images in the Old Testament that are picked up and used in the New Testament. But what I found when you get to the New Testament is that they are not just used and, if you like, rubber stamped. They are expanded, and the images are not just of dead corpses being, destroyed and annihilated. You've got pictures of, again, associated with fire and so on, of wailing and gnashing of teeth, which seems to suggest that this fire is not just going to annihilate people. Because if you're going to annihilate people, there's not going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. At the very least, there's not going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth very long.
Yeah.
Because as we know, fire can consume people pretty quickly.
Sure.
The other thing is that, again, Revelation speaks of the chapter 14, the fate of the lost there, and talks about the smoke of their torment going up forever. Now, you could argue just the smoke is going up forever, but I think implicitly it's suggesting that it's not just smoke is going up forever, it's going up forever because the torment's ongoing. Again, if the torment was just sort of terminal, the smoke of that torment wouldn't need to keep on going up forever. So
Sure.
that suggests, on that verse alone, really, that suggests some idea of eternal torment. Certainly the devil, Satan, whenever we read about his fate, we're told that his fate, those that are going to be cast into the lake of fire, are going to be tormented forever and ever. And it's not just forever, it's forever and ever, which is a very emphatic way of saying this. So the devil's fate is going to be torment forever and ever. That's what Revelation clearly teaches, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. Then you go back to Matthew 25, and we're told that the fate of the goats, as opposed to the fate of the sheep, the fate of the goats, those who are lost, is they're going to suffer the same fate as the devil and his angels, the fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels. So when you put all those texts together, you do get the impression, a very clear, a very strong impression, that the New Testament teaches not just the annihilation of the lost, but the ongoing punishment of the lost. And that ongoing punishment they will share with the devil and his minions. Now again, I suppose it brings into question, is the devil immortal? Certainly, he seems to be. He certainly seems to be less mortal than human beings, in that he's been around for a very long time.
Yeah.
So presumably, the supernatural beings like the devil and his angels are, in some sense, immortal, and that will allow them to be tormented forever and ever. Presumably, then, those who share that fate of their human beings, that either have to be sustained by God miraculously, so God will sustain them, or else when they're resurrected, their resurrected bodies will have some kind of immortal capacity that our present bodies don't.
Yeah.
But either way, either God has to give them God has to give them the capacity to endure forever if they're going to be tormented forever and punished forever.
Yeah.
So the question is, will God do that? Can we conceive of a God who thinks that's just? And that brings in the whole question of the justice of eternal torment. The main argument against eternal torment, I think, really is that we've only committed a finite number of sins. So if even the worst of us has only committed a finite number of sins, therefore why should God punish us infinitely, indefinitely, forever and ever? That doesn't seem to be just. That doesn't seem to be fair. That's the main argument really against the traditional position.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I've heard both positions, and it can be argued very strongly on both sides. I certainly can stomach the concept of terminal punishment much more.
I think most people could.
Yeah.
In fact, there'd be something wrong if you couldn't.
Yeah. No, sure. Sure. Yeah. So like, I want to favor that, but as you mentioned, it's really difficult to get past those verses in the New Testament. There's not a lot of room there. Just looking at those verses, unless you're arguing it from a perspective, like ones that you maybe just put forward. And I've heard some good ones, but it's a fascinating topic. It's one that I think it's worth looking into. When I first heard the concept of terminal punishment, I thought that was just heresy, really. But then I saw, well, there's a biblical way of coming to that understanding. It's not just our sensitivities, not wanting to believe in it. Yeah. Okay. But you tend to favor the eternal punishment. Is that kind of what I'm gathering?
Well, favor might be too strong, but certainly I find it hard not to believe in it, because I find it hard to get around those verses that seem to suggest that that and nothing else.
Sure. Yeah. I got you.
But if it wasn't for those verses, I think I would say yes, terminal punishment is exactly what the Bible teaches.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there are just a number of verses that are a sticking point for me that it's hard to actually. I think the other sticking point really is the justice issue. Like, does the Bible really teach that people who have committed monstrous atrocities are going to get the exact same punishment as if you like good living people who just simply have turned their back on God or turned their back on Christ? It's the same punishment for all.
Sure, yeah.
Or is there divine justice? So the Hitlers and the Pol Pots and so on of this world, are they going to be punished just the same way as your average Joe? Or will God's justice demand that person gets, sort of worse treatment than, if you like, worse torment than someone who hasn't? Like, I think any kind of torment, any kind of everlasting torment would be horrible. It wouldn't be pleasant.
No, yeah.
But I think that Jesus does seem to indicate that some people will be beaten with many blows and some with fewer blows.
Sure.
And that seems to suggest that there are degrees of punishment even in hell.
Yeah.
So, like, no one wants to go there at all.
Yeah.
It's a very unpleasant place, but I think it'll be even more unpleasant for some people than for others.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And that kind of brings me to my next question I was going to ask about judgment. Because, of course, we're kind of talking about judgment for non-believers now. I'd like to compare and contrast that to judgment for believers. What does that look like? Because it seems to also be an aspect, just like you described, there being varying degrees of punishment in hell, seem to be varying degrees of rewards in heaven. So, how does judgment for a believer, outside of maybe just like your destination, how does that differ for a believer and a non-believer?
Quite honestly, I'm not sure, Samuel. I used to think that there were rewards in heaven, just as there are degrees of punishment in hell. When I did this research, I came to the conclusion that there isn't so much evidence for degrees of reward in heaven. There's certainly evidence for degrees of responsibility, but I'm not sure if that's the same thing as degrees of reward. The crown of life is what we're promised. Everlasting life is what we're promised. Some people, Paul says, will be saved by the skin of their teeth.
Right.
Again, I'm not sure what it means eternally for someone who has been saved by the skin of their teeth. Is their eternal future going to be significantly different from the person who has been fully dedicated to serving Jesus their whole life? I'm not just sure. Like, I don't think the Bible is clear enough on that one.
Yeah.
Like, in a sense, we're looking forward to a place where there'll be no more sin, no more death, no more pain, and so on. So every redeemed person will share that experience. So heaven will be heaven for whoever's there.
Yeah.
It'll be a wonderful, blessed place.
Sure. Yeah.
So I don't want to try to do away from that, but I'm not sure what if there are some kind of, let's put it, rewards, what those rewards look like in the new heaven and new earth. I think we need to be careful we don't sort of think sort of very materialistically.
Yeah, sure.
We tend to think very materialistically in terms of rewards and so on, but maybe heavenly rewards are very different from our concept or anything we can even imagine.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good point. Just heaven in general. We have a lot of answers, but of course there's still questions, for many people as well. So, I like that, that you leave room for wonder, I suppose. This will be my last question. Kind of going back to where we started about the intermediate state. What is your thoughts, takes on near-death experiences?
Again, when I was doing the research for the book, I had to read some of that to see what they were saying and so on. I came to the conclusion, mainly on the basis of the sort of the medical opinion on this, that what people describe as near-death experiences can be explained medically. And therefore, I wasn't convinced that you could have a sort of a near-death experience where you go to heaven for a day or go to heaven for an hour or two or whatever the case may be. Like one of the things I found quite interesting when I was doing the research was that near-death experiences are claimed not just by Christians but by people of all. And that made me think that whatever they're talking about, it's probably some kind of common thing. Well, maybe common's the wrong way to describe it, but what I mean by common, I mean it's common to all people, whether they're religious or irreligious, whether they're Christian or atheist and so on. That experience they're describing is something that I think can be medically explained. In terms of what's going on in the brain when your heart starts beating and so on. So I think that there is a medical explanation to the kind of experience that people are describing as near-death experiences. So can you have a sort of a foretaste of heaven or hell and then come back from the brink? I'm not sure you can. Obviously Samuel had a near-death experience, but it wasn't a near-death experience, it was a death experience, and he comes back, he's brought back to talk to Saul. So that's, I feel like, a biblical example of but it's not really a near-death experience. The near-death experience tends to be something that it's a fleeting thing. It's somebody in the throes of death has this experience of an explicit bodily experience and so on, where they're sort of taken out of their human shell and they can see what's going on in the room. Again, maybe it's just the skeptic in me, but that probably could be explained in terms of audible perceptions and so on, things that are going on around them. So I'm just not convinced that the claimed near-death experiences are actual experiences of heaven or the afterlife.
Sure.
So I don't want to rule them out, but if there is a medical explanation to them, which I think there is, I don't want to sort of rule them all in. So could someone have a near-death experience? I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe they could. But if it turns out that they couldn't, I'll not be surprised. Again, I think those common and they claim near-death experiences are probably to be explained medically rather than explained spiritually.
Sure.
But can someone have a spiritual experience through that? I think they can. So some people, after their near-death experience, come to faith. Yeah. But interestingly, a lot of people don't. Yeah. Which I find bizarre, that they've had this near-death experience and even that doesn't convince them to get right with God. Well, I suppose it does tie in with what Jesus said. Even if someone were to come back from the dead, they wouldn't believe.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think I read one book about it. I've heard several accounts. Like I've had at least one guest who had an experience that shared his. Because you have people, like you said, from all different backgrounds who all different beliefs. Kind of like the one common thing is the light in the tunnel. but you have people that have like a heavenly experience, but then you also have people that have a hellish experience. And oddly, those are the people that tend to end up having a life change afterwards. The ones that have like a near, like a hellish experience, and they get scared straight. But you got me thinking when you started talking about biblical examples. I'm curious what you think about. Paul said he was taken to the third heaven. Some people would say that's a near-death experience because he was near-death. I forget which chapter in Acts, but they would attribute that near-death experience. Him being near-death in Acts, and then him recalling the third heaven.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned that one, because I think that is actually a good example where Paul, when he's describing it, says he doesn't know if it's in the body or out of the body.
Yeah.
So to me, that's an argument for two things. It's an argument for an interim state. Like Paul obviously believed that there was a possibility of an interim state. And it also would be an argument then for you could have a near-death experience if Paul wasn't sure. If that experience happened after one of his stonings, which is I think fairly likely that's what he's talking about, when he had that out-of-body experience. Then I suppose that is a biblical example of a near-death experience. I
kind of thought about Stephen when he was being stoned as well. He said before he died, he said he could see Jesus. And that was he was clearly alive when that happened. So you could say that he was near death.
That would be maybe an example of the curtain being sort of pulled away. Drawn back. And again, So is that what we mean by near-death experiences, where people, some people claim to see ghosts in this life. Some people have that sort of experience, in the throes of death. And come back from it. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I'd go back to I think a lot of them could be explained neurologically.
Sure.
And therefore, if it can be explained neurologically, I think we need to be very careful that we don't make too much of them. But Paul, I'm glad you mentioned the Paul case, because that's a good example of where Paul's not quite sure, whether he was alive or dead when he had that sort of experience.
And I agree with you. It could be a bit of both, and people tend to get, they just are crazed for a near-death experience in a story, and they want to build doctrine on it. And there's all sorts of books that you can buy, and even movies about the books. And
I had a near-death experience of a different kind before Christmas. And just after the lockdown ended here, the week after lockdown, I ended up in hospital for heart surgery. I think my main artery was 90% blocked. And whenever the surgeon was talking to me about the operation they was going to do, so I said that the success rate's really good. I said, what is it? He said, well, only 1 every 200 don't make it. And I was expecting, because all the talk had been about AstraZeneca at the time, and they're talking about 1 every 200,000 or one, big, even bigger figures. My mouth just fell when he said 1 every 200, because I thought that's not as hopeful as I was hoping he was going to say.
Our definitions are very good. It's different,
But why I mention it, whenever they told me that I was going to go in for this heart surgery that I mightn't have come through, one of the first things I started doing was preparing my funeral service, at least getting ready for, getting the hymns and so on chosen and things like that. And God used it really wonderfully to encourage me at that time, because I was basically faced with the prospect that I think the next day really I was going into surgery and I mightn't come out of it. So with that in mind, I basically started looking at the hymns I would use. I'd like to have sung at my funeral and things like that. Wrote sort of letters to my wife and boys and so on, and my mother, just sort of to encourage them, because I knew that everybody was really quite tense and stressed at the time. But why I mention this, God gave me such a great sense of peace. as I was sort of faced with potential imminent death. And I think that's the most important thing. Hopefully that comes across in the book. The most important thing about death and the afterlife is that whatever you think about it, that we're ready for it, we're prepared for it. So that if death comes suddenly or slowly, whenever it comes, we know that we're right with God. We know that we're peace with God through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we've got that assurance that God will take us safe into his everlasting arms. I think that's the thing that I'd want to sort of leave people with.
Absolutely.
Make sure that they're right with God and ready for death and the afterlife.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's our blessed hope. Yeah. So for anyone listening that doesn't have that assurance, I mean, don't wait. You can make that decision today. That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing your personal experience with that and tying this episode up. And nice and neat with the bow there. That's a cherry on top. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that is one thing that's central to the gospel, and as a believer, that death has no power of us, and we have nothing to fear. In fact, it's Paul said it was that he was sort of torn, because it was better to be with Christ. And that's fantastic. So thank you so much for coming on and for sharing and for writing the book.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Samuel.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So I'll invite you to kind of share, how people can get in touch with you or where they can buy your books, and then you can close us out in prayer.
Okay. Probably the easiest way to get in touch with me is through my email address at Moore College, which is just paul.williamson@moore, moore.edu.au. And if they wanted to get a copy of the book, probably the easiest way would be through the like of Amazon, or Book Depository. Do you have Book Depository in the US?
I guess not. I've not heard of that, but I'll put a link for the listener. I'll put a link for the book, so if they're interested, they can pick it up in the show notes.
Okay. I pray.
Close this out.
Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for bringing life and immortality to hope and life through the gospel. And we thank you for our Lord Jesus Christ, the one who has gone through death and has been raised from the dead, and who has guaranteed that hope of eternal life for everyone who believes. And Father, we pray that you might indeed help each of us as we think about the future, as we think about our personal future, death and the afterlife, that you might help us to put our trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, whom to know is life eternal. In his name we pray. Amen.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to share this with somebody you know. Like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting app, leave us a rating and review. You can email me at theweirdchristianpodcast@gmail.com. And with that being said, we'll catch you on the next one.